Cybersecurity Conference by CSAP. The future begins with security.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in another session of this Cybersecurity Conference 2025. Today, I have the honor to be with Aric, Asti, and Scott West. We are going to introduce them in a little bit, and we are going to address a very important topic, concepts about zero trust and adaptive security. Since the first introduction of this concept, zero trust, in 2010 by John Kinderberg, there's been many interpretations, some of them a little bit misleading, taking to some people to think that zero trust is all about technologies. But it's more than that. It's a concept, it's an architecture, it's a mentality. And the same goes with adaptive security. Sometimes some organizations think that adaptive security is a silver bullet, so they will have security that will protect the organization from every single threat. But it's not just like that. So we need to apply these concepts correctly, and we have our subject matter experts, Aric, Asti, and Scott West. Thank you so much, guys, for being here with us today. So could you please introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about your background experience and what brings you here? Let's start with Aric, please.
Sure, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Irwin. It's a pleasure to be here. So the background I have is about 25 years in the industry. I have worked in the private sector, primarily in the United States. I've also worked with the US military. I've worked in academic settings with universities. I've had the opportunity to respond to companies dealing Fortune 500 companies, large household names in the United States. Dealt with ransomware, BEC, really cybersecurity events or incidents in those organizations. Looking forward to talking a little bit about the defensive strategies that we can implement using zero trust and adaptive security. So again, thank you for having me. Scott?
Yeah, so Scott West, good to meet everybody. Happy to be here. My background is very much like Aric's. I've been involved in industry for many, many years. I got introduced to computing in the Army in the early 90s, came out in mid-90s at American Express, worked through there, through IBM Global Service and through PayPal, where I ran the security engineering organization. After that, I've moved into kind of solutioning roles, helping customers come up with programs to solve their problems. So happy to be here, happy to share my knowledge.
Thank you so much, guys, for being here with us again. So as an intro to the topic, I want to read just a small paragraph of this book, Zero Trust, written by Gregory Rasner. You are going to see the paragraph in your screens. So it says, our adversaries don't have the element of surprise anymore. We know what they're after: money, information, secrets. We also know how they get it. No matter what technology you use, what industry you're in, or what role you may play in your organization, the one common denominator of the thing that attackers exploit is trust. So without further ado, we're going to start with the questions. This is going to be an interview to our experts. So we'll start with you, Scott. What are the most common misconceptions about the concept zero trust?
So I think the biggest perception is you can't or create a zero trust environment with a single. It's kind of a branding. We've always talked about having multiple strategies, multiple pieces in place, and it's really about protecting, different components, whether it's the users, the devices that they're using, some verification, taking a look at the applications people have access to, and the data that they have access to. The premise is really to get inside out, thinking that a intruder or an attacker is already on your network. So how do you build for that, and how do you design?
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. Now let's talk about adaptive security, and this question is for Aric, Asti. Is adaptive security a new concept, or it's been around for some time?
Yeah, thanks, Irwin. So adaptive, first talk about what that really means. The formal definition is a cybersecurity approach that continuously adjusts to the changing landscape of threats, vulnerabilities, and risks in real time. And that's really the key with adaptive security. It's in real time. So when you think of traditional security defenses that we have implemented over the years, such as firewalls, even antivirus or early maybe EDR, most of those had to deal with static rules where if a certain condition is met, then something else happens. So on a firewall, for example, if you had a particular port or you saw traffic going to a port, you could deny or allow, and those are your options. But with adaptive security, the program itself, or the firewall, the EDR solution, is monitoring the environment and in real time finding those anomalies and then executing on them once it's configured. So as I said, examples of adaptive security that we see now, or earlier on, we would see IDS, intrusion detection systems, or intrusion prevention systems. Those were dynamic at the time because you could have conditions that would fire when a scenario presented itself. As technology has improved, I think the next iteration, major iteration of adaptive security came with EDR solutions, endpoint detection and response, where the EDR solution was able to identify or not just look at a hash, but look at what a file was accessing and identifies that normal or anomalous behavior and then block that. So the question is this a new concept or has it been around for a while? It's been around for quite a while. Certainly in the late 90s, early 2000s, we would have examples of adaptive security, but certainly not as thorough as we have now. And it seems with machine learning, automation, obviously artificial intelligence, that this is rapidly expanding and becoming much more efficient than what we would see from those static type of alerts.
Okay, so this is more dynamic. And thinking about this, Scott, what are the pillars for adaptive security?
So I think if we build on what Aric stated, prediction is the first one, right? It is really about understanding what is happening under normal circumstances and when does that circumstance change. It's that to the point of the anomalous behavior, you have to set a baseline to figure out what a computer does, what network traffic does, what access to applications is, things like that. You establish the baseline, and then the prediction is when that baseline starts to modify drastically or change drastically. Moving through the other ones, responses, actually I'll take detection next. So again, we see the prediction, seeing what the baseline is. The detection is I've identified something, a set of controls has gone off. We're now detecting this as an anomalous behavior, followed by response, which is how do we block this behavior? Again, different solutions can talk identity, which could have levels of MFA and enhance as it goes along, or make things more difficult as they progress. And then I think the last one is prevention, and really just how do you stop it in its tracks, right? Again, if you're looking at that from a baseline standard, the normal behavior, mapping that out, or finding the behavior after that analysis and being able to stop it and stop things from progressing.
Okay, excellent. So far, we have talked about zero trust. So never trust, always verify is not a solution. You can use technology. Then as creating an architecture to protect what is important for the organization, And we have talked about adaptive security as well. Its prediction is more dynamic, it's not a static security. So now let's see how these two concepts complement each other. Why is Zero Trust considered the foundation for adopting adaptive security?
Take that. So the reason Zero Trust is considered a foundation for adaptive security is because it really has these core principles of continuous verification, dynamic context, aware decision making. And there's more to that, but again, if we think back to the traditional ideas of a perimeter-based defense, so you have a firewall, you want to keep the threat actors out, and you want to ensure that your internal users are somewhat protected. And we think of this, there's several analogies, a moat around a castle, a gate, a locked door, etc. That's becoming more of the antiquated practice, where Zero Trust, it's not just the perimeter, it's securing all the rooms in the house or the rooms in an office building. And it's continually checking the status of that security. That's really what sets this apart. I also want to mention that Zero Trust is a framework, and this can take years to implement it. It's not, as Scott said, a solution or one piece of software that you buy and install and you have Zero Trust, or a piece of hardware. That's not how it works. But getting back to the broader topic of adaptive security, and then why Zero Trust is that foundation. So continuous validation and monitoring. Zero Trust really makes sure that every request on the network is vetted when it's implemented at a high maturity level. So what does that mean? It's not just access to data, but it's identity and access management. It's looking at a low level system calls. It will actually map out behavior. So when we think of access times, if you have set hours from maybe 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., that's when most of the people work, but you see a login happen at 4 in the morning, well, Zero Trust, using the framework of Zero Trust, you could time that really shouldn't happen and block that. There's access controls. So when we're talking about data access, or again login information, that's all part of trust. You can configure risk-based security decisions if there is low risk data. So low risk data would be text that don't get any important information, or maybe binary files of programs that really matter to the organization if they're accessed by a threat actor. But if you have Word documents that contain information, you have client information, identifiable information, the sensitive data that we ensure is protected, and you can adjust that scale using something like Zero Trust. Also, there's integration with threat intelligence. So threat intelligence is the idea of, again, in real time, cataloging what type of attacks threat actors are using, how into networks, what industries are being targeted, what particular threat actor groups are, which type of company. All of that can be tailored to a trust framework specifically for your organization. Mainly, I'd say granular access control, or granular control over access. Not only is there the concept of the privilege access, which we've tried to implement that for years, but again, we can minimize our privileged access to data, to network segments, to external, internal resources. It's much more granular than how we have implemented security controls in the past. So that's why Zero Trust is a more specific framework when we talk about adaptive security. Adaptive security being the larger concept, zero trust being the framework of how we start implementing that type of solution.
Excellent, thank you. And you mentioned at the beginning of your explanation about traditional cybersecurity. And I remember reading about John Kinderberg saying that traditional cybersecurity was like an M&M, like the candy, because it was solid on the outside, but it was soft on the inside, meaning that we didn't trust anything that came from the outside, but once anyone was inside the organization, we trusted that. So zero trust is a change in this kind of paradigms, right? So you already mentioned some of the key things that should be taken into consideration when implementing zero trust. This question is for Scott West. Let's break it down and talk a little bit about one of the main elements of zero trust. Let's talk about identity and access management. How does it look when identity and access management is well implemented inside an organization?
So, again, this always is a fun topic. If people are still managing IAM or identity and access management for individuals, they're wrong. We need to put in place a group or a persona to start managing those things through. So it covers somebody from onboarding to offboarding, right? If you go into an organization as an employee, then that's one trigger or one group. If you go in as a contractor, that's a completely different group, right? So building those at a group level, HR should only have access to HR components. Finance should only have access to finance components. And managing those groups makes it a lot easier. And then we couple on the privilege access management, so making sure that there's a secondary system, making sure you use multi-factor authentication. Those pieces are also critical in kind of establishing a solid IAM or an identity and access program. So it's really, and I think that one of the best places I saw when I was working in the industry was actually when they had your group or your identity and access management set off based on the department that you were in. Because the department should only have certain functions, they should only be able to support certain components or certain systems. And when they set that up, it was kind of instantaneous. So if you changed organizations or changed departments, then you instantly got that department's access or that level of access, but you were also instantly stripped of any access that you had prior. So it's really taking a look at it at the group level, breaking it down and assigning permissions to groups, but also from a application level, it's really making sure that the right groups only have access to the right applications. Really making sure, like I said, if a contractor should never be able to hit an HR site. It's just building practices like that and really examining the users, the groups of users that you have in your organization, and then leveraging also the application side and eventually the data side as to what should those groups have access to and only have access to. We shouldn't leave it an open door for anybody anymore. Everybody's got to kind of stay in their lane.
Okay. And talking about the access part, do you have any comments regarding traditional VPN usage versus a more robust usage of technologies that will provide a more restricted access to the users?
So, I mean, as technologies evolve, VPN was you get access to the internal network, but you have access to the entire internal network. The new technologies that are coming in place are setting up micro SSL tunnels from a point on the internet where you have secure access to only the specific applications internally in your organization. Being able to leverage those smaller tunnels and not have that giant gate sitting on your firewall that says, I'm a VPN server, try to beat me up.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Let's talk about a little bit about network segmentation. It is funny because sometimes when we go with some organizations to provide some guidance regarding cybersecurity and we ask, is your network segmented? They said, yes, we have the server segment and we have the user segment, and that's it. So what can you provide regarding your experience about a good network segmentation, Aric?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a topic that comes up pretty regularly when we have cybersecurity incidents. So when someone talks about network segmentation, or when, as you mentioned, customers will say, yes, I have a segmentation. My servers are separate from the local area network or from the workstations. That actually may be true. You could segment a network using subnets or VLANs. You can configure static routes or even dynamic routes to access those resources, but that's not really the context of what we're talking about when we say network segmentation. When we talk about network segmentation, and Scott mentioned this already, a good example is when you hear that term segmentation, you should ask yourself a question like, can someone in human resources remote desktop into a domain controller? And we see that very, very often, that even though there's segmentation on a network, it hasn't been thought out in terms of data access. Even identity access management should prevent some type of request outside of what that user should have. So the challenge for network engineers is you still need a path to the domain controller for authentication. But what you don't need is an absolute path to that domain controller. Or another example would be someone in finance. Should someone in finance be logging into a domain controller? Or should someone in the production environment have the opportunity to remote desktop into HR department, etc.? So we want to think about segmentation in terms of, like Scott alluded to, he actually said before, of groups, permission sets, etc. And that's why this adaptive security and zero trust framework is such a powerful entity that can really defend your network. But I also want to comment that there are concerns about zero trust, and those concerns, or the additional concerns that I want to mention, are the practical implementation of zero. So again, it can take years for an organization to go from nothing to some type of maturity level with trust. Specific items you should be aware of are legacy systems, compatibility issues, user and device authentication. Some zero trust uses MFA, or one component is using multi-factor authentication. Some legacy systems may not support that. User and device authentication may also not support it. So there's performance issues that can happen. It does get complicated, so there's a scalability problem when you're implementing zero trust that can have a real world effect in the organization. You have a more complex environment that you're managing for access management policies. Employees may resist a little bit on that if there are more requests to authenticate throughout the day. Integration with other security tools can be a problem, or at least, again, more complex. So there's a lot that goes into this. Cost is another. When we talk about zero trust, I just want to be fair that while it is a fantastic framework and it does provide a great basis or a foundation for including new security measures in an organization, there is a heavy lift, as we say, or there's a lot of effort that can be sustained when you're trying to do this. But back to the network segmentation. So my advice is think about your organization and think about what users, what should they have access to and what should they not have access to. But you think about that from data, from the network perspective, and then think about if a threat actor is in your network, what can they access from these systems. So if someone from HR clicks on a phishing link and a threat actor gains access to that workstation, you can't think of an IT administrator, but you want to think about what else can they see on your network if it's flat or if it's segmented.
Okay, and given your vast experience, oh, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I was saying a little bit of a tangent there, but thank you. Yep.
Okay, so following after this great explanation you just gave, given your vast experience in incident response and forensics, do you think a good network segmentation is going to help to contain lateral movement or any other compromise inside the network? Because we have to assume that the network is already compromised. That is part of the principles of the zero trust. So do you think that could help to contain an incident?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anytime that you can restrict movement in the network, that's a big win. So a couple of years ago, I had an incident where there was a production environment, and the incident actually started in the legacy environment. What happened is in production, there were all the newer tools. There was an MDR service. There was network segmentation to some degree. However, the organization had failed to shut down the legacy side of the network. They would occasionally access some of that data. And I think this is a scenario for organizations. The legacy network is not updated with security. Their threat actor got in on the side and then pivoted, or we call it lateral movement, into the production side and actually stole sensitive data to the company. So it's imperative that organizations prioritize security in their environment, and you don't have to spend a lot of money on a new product to do this, but rather do some thought exercises of, if I'm on one location, what can I access? If I'm on this computer, what can I access? That just makes the job a lot harder for a threat actor. If you make their job harder, you slow them down. And if you slow them down, that gives you more time to defend against what they're doing or detect them.
Okay.
And they'll always go after an easier, softer target.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Thank you, guys. So, Scott, let's move to data protection. And the question I have here is, in traditional security, access to data was given to a user once it was authenticated. But how does this change in a zero trust environment with adaptive security principles?
So data security is something that's more and more dear to my heart as time progresses. It's a problem when we talk data governance, data security, that we have kind of been ignoring for the last 20 years. A lot of it has been security through obscurity, right? I'm going to put my data here where I hope nobody else can find it, and I'll just not tell them about it. And the reason this is more important today is with generative AI and everything coming along, we're also seeing that this opens up a lot more issues than it has in the past. But talking about how zero trust and how adaptive security works as part of this, it is really, you have to look at data security as an entire program. You have to be able to classify your data, right? It should be a risk-based system on how you store the data, the security controls that you have around it, and then like the adaptive pieces that are monitoring who's accessing it. So it should always be harder for somebody to get secret or confidential information than it is for somebody to Aric mentioned it today, access a script or see something that somebody wrote it's benign, right? So you have to take a look at it in a couple of different ways. You have to build out the classification, the taxonomy, make sure you understand how you put it and segment it. And going back to network segmentation, it should be data segmentation as well. You should have multiple levels of data classification, and the more, I guess, risky it is to the business to get out, the tighter the security controls need to be in place on it. And again, you know, data access programs have come a long way, and to see the adaptive components in that match back to kind of an EDR or a user behavioral analysis tool to talk about how a user is being risky. But like I said, this one is kind of near and dear to my heart, because this is, as AI is evolving, as it's getting access to giant data stores, it's really opening the eyes, and there's a lot more security concerns around it than there has been in the past. So really start taking a look at that and starting to put them in place.
Thank you. You made a lot of emphasis regarding data classification, a good data classification. And I have a follow-up question regarding this. Sometimes we find situations where organizations want to implement DLP controls without doing the data classification first. So what will be your opinion or recommendation in this regard?
So I actually ran a DLP program for about 2 years, and I can tell you that that takes a lot of work and a lot of effort, because a lot of it is based on keywords or triggers or events, and not looking at how to classify documents and then look at handling it based upon the classification of the document, right? DLP needs something to hook into, needs something to see, needs something to gauge differences. You know, again, when we talk, if we tie it all together, an HR person should be able to access something that has employee information with social security numbers, with, you know, birth dates and things like that, but nobody else in the company should, right? So you build the DLP program so it can catch that personal information if it's being shared or used by anybody outside of HR. It's really, there's so many moving parts as part of a solid DLP program. You have to get a lot of pieces right. That, like your point, the classification has to be right. The DLP program has to be right. Certain things need to be recognized as needing to be allowed. And how do you make sure that that transaction happens as it needs to, but how can you thwart everything else?
Okay, excellent. So we have talked about zero trust concepts, now some practical applications into the real world scenarios, some of the things that we need to take into consideration if we are going to start this journey to implement zero trust. Now, we want to listen to some real case scenarios where zero trust would have been an excellent approach, but it wasn't the case. So, Aric, do you have any real life example that you can share with us?
Sure. So when we talk about a cybersecurity incident, or sometimes the word is breach, there's a legal term in the United States that is associated with breach, so we try not to use it for various reasons. But if there's an incident, let's assume there's a ransomware incident. And typically the way ransomware happens is the threat actor has to gain access into the network. Now, there was recently a disclosure of FortiGate firewalls that were vulnerable. There were, I believe, hundreds of thousands of credentials that were on the internet. There was essentially a company IP address name. Now, the threat actor will have access into as a company user. So without zero trust, now you have a unauthorized user rating or pretending to be a legitimate user in the environment. This is in every ransomware case that I've worked. The threat, if they're lucky, they'll find administrator access or administrator accounts or administrator access. So then it's pretty much game over, because without breaching like like Scott said, if there's no DLP or IAM, identity access management, and you basically allow the admin account full access, not only across all of the data, the files, etc., to prevent an incident from happening. So the threat actors get into the network. If they're not an administrator, what they will do is most likely pivot or lateral move into a domain controller. And then they will attempt, we call it privilege escalation. So they move from a user who's not an administrator to get access. And there's all sorts of, you can do this, especially on Windows servers, it's very common. But again, talking about zero trust, so if zero trust already assumes that your network is compromised and that you have a threat actor in the network, that lateral movement would be shut down. If there is a time difference, a lot of times we see there's different time zones that are being used. So there can be activity at 3 in the morning or 4 in the morning. So if there's anomalous behavior, zero trust would prevent that. When the threat actors gain access to data and attempt to remove the data or take data from the environment, zero trust would have prevented that exfiltration. And then finally what happens is once the threat actor has gained access into the network, they do some reconnaissance, they look around, they try to find high value servers such as domain controllers, file servers, database servers, etc. They then move to those systems as an internal administrator. They take the data and then they run a program that encrypts all of the files on those systems. So many times, in cases, those servers stay online. The threat actors do not encrypt the system file, they just encrypt ancillary files or data files. So you're left with a environment that's kind of running, but any of the data you need is encrypted. And really the only way to get that is through backups or purchasing a restoration key or a decryption key from the threat actor. All of those cases, zero trust would prevent every stage of that if implemented to a full maturity level, or at least make it more difficult for the to get in. I don't want to cite specific client for the confidentiality and also respect to them, but that's the basic makeup of what happened a ransomware event, how the threat actors move across the environment. They take data, they're exfiltrating. If you see a big data spike at 3 in the morning, that should be an indicator of anomalous behavior that zero trust should identify, your tooling should identify and shut that down immediately. That would eliminate, I think, the vast majority of ransomware cases that we encounter.
Okay, great example and a lot of lessons learned here. Okay, thank you, Aric. So, Scott, what are the tools we should be looking into that help with zero trust and adaptive security?
I'm going to start with something that's not a tool, but it can be leveraged as one, and that's a network penetration test. Running it both internally and externally across your environment, because that's going to give you a very detailed report of the holes that you need to patch, right? And it can help guide you, right? It's really going to vet out what controls that you have in place, what is working and what's not. We talk a lot about segmentation, whether it's the network, whether it's the identities, whether it is the data, and kind of the pen test runs through all of that to see where it's working and where it's not. Outside of that, I think, again, we start talking about user identity and access management along with user behavioral analysis and privileged access management, right? Those are, to me, the key pieces. If you start with identity and then go to network, then everything else kind of falls in place together. Again, it's probably more of a principle of understanding where your big gaps are, putting a plan in place to address those and looking at technology that does give you that adaptive capability, looking at and understanding the behaviors that are happening on a normal circumstance, and then identifying, triggering, and being able to react to the anomalous behavior that it sees.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so I have some questions from the people that knew that this conference was going to take place. One of the questions is it possible to implement zero trust in a small part of the network, because that is the most important part of the organization, and leave the rest for later? Or would that defy the whole principle of zero trust?
Yeah, I'll go first if you don't mind.
Question.
If you don't mind, Scott. Yeah, so I would argue not. I don't think that's a good idea, and the reason, I understand why, because there could be a more pointed lift in a high priority portion of the network. It's not a good idea for the reason that I cited earlier with the customer who had a legacy system and a production system. I think if you're going to go through the methodology and the effort to deploy controls, at least on some part of your network, my response would be, why not deploy it across the other parts of your network? Now, if you have one section of your network that does not talk to, there's no cross communication, could maybe even say that it's air gapped with another portion of your network, then perhaps there's a case for that. But in most instances that I can think of, most corporations that I've dealt with, there's always a connection between network segments to some degree. And while you would in fact defend that high priority section of the network, you're leaving the other sides vulnerable. Scott, any
just to add on to that, well, not necessarily a disagreement, but to add on, I think those portions of the network are where we need the static controls the most, right? That's where we have, historically, that's where you put the firewalls, that's where you put those pieces. When we start talking about adaptive security and zero trust, we're talking more than just a server or a NAS device or anything like that. We're looking at the behavioral aspects of what's happening across the entire environment or the entire ecosystem, and breaking it down: identity, network, data access, application controls. So to me, the two concepts they're complementary, not competitive. So an adaptive security program and a zero trust program is always going to be run at the highest level possible and pushed down. But in those network segments that where you have critical data, go back in and again enforce the security controls that you have in place. Make sure that it is, the static controls, the firewalls, who has access into the environment. Make sure that that is locked down. But those, to me, are two different functions.
Okay, great. So, like you guys already mentioned, zero trust is a framework. Based on that framework, there are different levels for the different pillars. There's identity, device, network, applications, etc. And we have the traditional security, initial, advanced, and optimal. So the question is it possible to implement to different levels of maturity, different pillars, and keep making progress, or every pillar has to be at the same level of maturity to have a good implementation of the zero trust network framework?
So on this one, Aric, there are key components of the zero trust framework that you need to get right out of the gate, right? You can't control access to data until you have identity nailed down. You can't control access to the network until you have the network segmentation nailed down. So in my mind, those are the two key components to come out of the gate with, right? You have to build a solid identity and access management program. You have to really start looking at that network as, how do I ensure that the network stops things from just moving. It shouldn't be a river. Water shouldn't just be able to flow everywhere. It should really be a series of dams to make sure that only the appropriate things go to the appropriate places. And once you get those two pieces right, then you can start bringing the other levels up.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add, just agree 100% with Scott. The only thing I would add is if the premise of that question is essentially where do I begin and how do I get started? In the U.S., CSC's site has a very good zero trust maturity model. They even have tables in there that can show you levels like Irwin mentioned, additional, initial, advanced, and optimal. And referencing those tables would give you a good starting point of where, not only where to begin, but where you could classify your current situation is at, or what your maturity model, where your maturity lies between those pillars. But I don't think it's a case where you don't try or you don't begin the process unless you're shooting for optimal across the board. I don't think that's reasonable because that's generally a multi-year exercise.
Okay. I think we don't have any other question from the audience. So any final comments or conclusions, recommendations that you want to give to the audience today?
Yeah, I'd say...
Sure. Go ahead, Scott.
Go ahead, Aric. I'll go. It's not insurmountable, right? There's a lot to get zero trust in place. The result is it's going to be worth it, right? You still have to have a blueprint. You still have to start working on security controls. Everybody's got regular requirements that they're trying to hit in some form or fashion, or investors that they need to be happy. So you're going to have to build the security program. It doesn't make sense to do it if you're not looking at the zero trust framework and you're not looking at ways that the adaptive security tools out there can assist in getting you further quicker.
Yeah, well said, Scott. And what I'd like to add to that is it depends who you are. If you are an executive, I would encourage you to reach out to your colleagues and ask if anyone has experienced, and they may not want to tell you this, but if they've experienced a ransomware event or even a BEC, business email compromise incident in their environment. Even as an IT professional, if you work in technology to some degree, ask your colleagues if anyone has firsthand experience with a cybersecurity incident. They don't have to give you specifics, but the follow-up question should be how painful and how expensive was it? And I think that answer is going to be surprising to most people, and that can be used to justify planning out an actual cybersecurity plan across your environment, whether it's using zero trust as a framework. If that seems like it is, as Scott said, that it's not insurmountable, but if it seems like too big of a lift, work with something. Use the CIS controls. Begin with hardware and software inventory management, but start adopting frameworks to identify gaps in your environment so you know where to go.
Okay, thank you so much, guys. So thank you for sharing your knowledge, experience, and wisdom with the audience. I'm sure this was very useful, and now we have a better understanding about zero trust and adaptive security. Y para la audiencia, muchas gracias por habernos acompañado y hasta la próxima.
Cybersecurity Conference by CSAP. The future begins with security.